Good evening, everybody. I'm Alice Roberts and I'm delighted to be hosting the Royal Society Book Prize event 2020. I'm joined tonight by three amazing communicators, Steve Jones, Fiona Fox and Rowan Hooper, and we'll be having a lively discussion about science communication. But first, a bit about the prize. It's been going for 33 years, but of course the Royal Society has been supporting science writing much longer than that, ever since Robert Hooke's beautiful book on micrographia, which was the first publication of the Royal Society in 1665. Tonight we'll be honouring that history of science communication, which has always been part of the Royal Society's mission, and we'll be discussing the importance of science communication in a time of pandemic. And then we will be announcing the winner of the 2020 Royal Society Science Book Prize, sponsored by Insight Investment. A couple of notes for anyone watching live this evening. We have live captioning available, and if you'd like to see those, please click the subtitles or closed captions button in the bottom bar on YouTube. And we'd love you to tweet during the event as well. Please use the hashtag SciBooks, all one word. So it is a magnificent shortlist of 6 books for the prize this year. We have The World According to Physics by Jim Alkalini, The Body, A Guide for Occupants by Bill Bryson, The Great Pretender, The Undercover Mission That Changed Our Understanding of Madness by Susanna Cahalan, Explaining Humans, What Science Can Teach Us About Life, Love and Relationships by Camilla Pang, The Double X Economy, Epic Power of Empowering Women by Linda Scott, and Transcendence, How Humans Evolved Through Fire, Language, Beauty and Time by Gaia Vince. They're all fantastic books. One of them is going to win the prize, and I'll be announcing that later. But this prize wouldn't be possible without the sponsor. So a really special thanks to Insight Investment for supporting the 2020 Book Prize and helping to raise the profile of science writing and to draw attention to these wonderful shortlisted books. Before we find out more about those 6 books and reveal the winner, we're going to discuss science writing and science communication in a time of pandemic more generally. And to do that, I'm joined by an amazing panel of experts in science communication, Steve Jones, Fiona Fox, and Rowan Hooper. Steve Jones is Emeritus Professor of Human Genetics at University College London. He's also a consummate science communicator as a broadcaster and an absolutely prolific author. Steve won the Royal Society Science Book Prize in 1994 with his book, The Language of Genes. He was shortlisted again in 1997 with In the Blood, and again in 2008 for Coral. Oh, and he was longlisted in 2010 as well. He's scooped up other accolades from the Royal Society as well. He was awarded the Royal Society Michael Faraday Prize and Lecture in 1996, and he's a Fellow of the Royal Society. So what are you up to at the moment, Steve? Another book, perhaps?
Yes, another damn thick black book, as Boswell said to Johnson. It's a book. It's got a good title. Whether it lives up to it or not, I don't know. The title is Sex, Age and Death, which I think covers most eventualities. And it's an attempt to link them together into a single narrative. And of course, at my age, I tend to concentrate on death.
Sounds amazing. Can't wait. Fiona Fox is Chief Executive of the Science Media Centre. She's a regular commentator on science in the media and the only representative from the scientific community invited to give evidence at the Levinson inquiry into press standards in the UK in 2012. She's an outspoken champion for openness in science, and she's received many accolades for her services to science, including an OBE, honorary fellowships of the Academy of Medical Science and the British Pharmacology Society. So what are you up to, Fiona?
COVID. That's the only thing in our lives at the Science Media Centre since mid-January, basically. And we've got an incredible list of 500-600 top eminent scientists who are expert on various aspects of the virus, and we're just putting them together every single day with journalists, organising briefings where they explain their findings and try and answer questions about all the very bewildering aspects of this virus. So I think my main mission here tonight is to just say maybe we should change this narrative about scientists not being good communicators, because honestly, since January, we have just watched thousands of amazing scientists on our airways, in our newspapers, on a daily basis, being clear communicators of incredibly complicated science. I think they're doing an amazing job, and I don't think we'll ever look back.
It's been quite overwhelming, hasn't it? I mean, we are in a year of pandemic, we are in a crisis, but we are also in a year of science communication, the like of which we've just never seen before. Rowan Hooper, he's senior editor at New Scientist magazine and host of New Scientist Weekly podcast. His background is evolutionary and conservation biology. He's a prolific writer too. He's been published in The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Wired, and The Economist. He's the author of Superhuman: Life at the Extremes of Mental and Physical Ability. That was published in 2018. And the upcoming How to Spend $1 Trillion. What's going on in the wonderful world of New Scientists then, Rowan?
Well, similarly to Fiona, it's very COVID heavy. And we're basically rotating COVID with other really cool stuff. And COVID goes into the corner and then it comes back out onto the cover again. And we're doing that as it's the biggest story of our lives, really, as science journalists. So we're absolutely all over that. And on the podcast, similarly, we pretty much every week we've talked about coronavirus from January onwards, and we've had guests on. So yeah, it's a question of juggling COVID and all the rest of the science that is still going on, and so that people don't get completely sick of it,
And when is your book out? That's out sometime next year.
January 14th. So we're just delaying publication to see what happens tonight in the US, and I'll make some last minute adjustments, but then out very soon.
Lovely. We look forward to that. So we're here tonight to celebrate science writing at a time when we're acutely aware of the importance of effective science communication. So I'd like to start by asking the panel, how do popular science books fit into this? How do popular science books help us prepare for crises like the one we find ourselves in? I wonder if you could take that first, Steve.
Yes, it's hard to know. I mean, I think popular science books are important, but in terms of immediacy and width of the audience, I think obviously radio and television have a more immediate effect. But I think the existence of popular science books is important in forming, as it were, the public narrative. And when I started writing my boring books, which is 30 years ago now nearly, you could walk into a bookshop, Waterstones or whatever, Daunt's, and you'd probably find a dozen or 15 science books. Some of them have remained famous, A Brief History of Time and the like, but you really wouldn't find a whole section. But now you walk into a big bookshop and there's shelf after shelf after shelf of them. And sometimes I do rather think there are too many. There's an awful lot of overlap. Strangely enough, there are rather few on pandemics. There are a couple, but there are dozens and dozens on psychology, human behavior, and that kind of stuff. And I wrote a few years ago a report for the BBC Trust on science coverage, which is generally rather positive. But I pointed out that actually there were huge parts of science which the BBC in particular and the media in general didn't much cover. I mean, chemistry, for example, very rarely came in. And if you look at science books, it's just the same. There are things like natural history, human behavior, doom about the future. These are very easy to write about, and there are dozens of books about them. But there are very few about, let's say, organic chemistry or cell biology, which are very repaying fields, but people don't write about them. So I think that's the thing I would complain about in today's avalanche of science books.
And Rowan, how do you feel about this question? Do you think that science books are important in helping arming us in terms of science literacy, or do you think there are just too many out there?
No, there aren't too many. I mean, I think there's enough space in the science book world for plenty of them. But I think the role of the good role that they have is not so much, preparing us for a pandemic specifically, as arming us with a kind of skeptical knowledge or a kind of curiosity to get to what's really going on. So if you read a lot of science books over the years, then you'll be able to scrutinize what you're hearing from government scientists or politicians with a bit of a different angle. And I think that's at the moment the thing that's been valuable about science writing.
And Fiona, what's your perspective on this? Do you think that?
I think just getting back to this narrative about taking scientists out of this kind of slightly odd group, this these nerdy people who sit in their labs and occasionally write books and occasionally do interviews. I just think that's really old-fashioned now. I don't think they are great science books. I think they're great books, and I applaud the Royal Society for championing them in this way. But you go into any bookshop now, and you will see your economists, and you'll see your fantastic novels, and you'll see your best-selling science books. And I think similarly, we need to stop talking about certain scientists are great science communicators, and the rest should stay in the lab. I think we're really seeing a time where the public are seeing scientists as critical to solving our problems and as important as politicians and historians and commentators and NHS workers. We're all people. I think that science, when I started, was really the "and finally," the quirky bit at the end of the news. And that has just completely transformed. If you wanted to be a journalist now, you'd want to be a science, health or environment journalist, because they're the kind of scientists who are going to solve all our problems. And I think we should get away from focusing on science books and talking about fantastic books that people want to read.
And do you see that literature as being important in terms of science literacy, not necessarily subject specific, but about increasing people's capacity for critical thinking, for instance?
Well, if I can tell you that I was offered this job 18 years ago, having not done a science GCSE, having never studied science, never worked in science. And the first thing I did was bought about 20, including several of Steve Jones's books, 20 popular science books, and spent the time between being appointed 3 months later, taking on the job, reading them all, and absolutely fell in love with science. So they certainly helped increase my understanding. Ben Goldacre's Bad Science taught me about clinical trials and how they work and which questions to ask. And indeed, we'll have taught many people who've read that book will be now asking the right questions about certain studies that they see in the media about COVID, because they understand clinical trials from reading a book that was on display in every bookshop.
And I do think you get something interesting from that long form as well. Obviously we have a lot of science journalism in newspapers of the paper variety and online as well. But I do think that if you have a book, you have the chance of getting into theory and quite a bit of detail and bringing people along on a fantastic intellectual journey. I mean, Rowan, your work bridges both, short form journalism and longer book writing.
Yeah, I think that I've only written one book so far, so I won't make any claim to anything I've done. But books change people's lives. People really do go on journeys when they get a book that speaks to them. I'm sure, Steve, you must have had many letters from biologists over the years who've said, I do what I do because I picked up one of your books when I was a kid or when I was an undergraduate. And the same thing happened to me. And I think that many scientists have got put on their path because of books that have really touched them and literally changed their lives. So yeah, they're vitally important.
Yeah, but actually, in my case, looking back on it, strangely enough, I have vivid memories of the first science book I read, and I was quite young. I was, of course, like all scientists, a completely introverted nerd at the time. I hope I've come out of my shell a little bit since then. But there's a book which maybe some of the others have read by a guy called Paul de Cruyff, which is called Microbe Hunters. And it was set, it's a kind of science as heroes book. It's very much a book of its time. But it's a fantastic book about how people, Paul de Koch found the germ theory, about tracing down the syphilis, agent of syphilis and salvarsan, malaria. And it's completely gripping because it mixes science stories with human stories. And I think that's the important thing. I mean, I'm lucky in what I write, and so like many others in my field, because as I say to my students in my first lecture at UCL, and I have to say I've made the same joke for 42 years, I stand up and I say, I'm a geneticist, and my job is to make sex boring. And they all look blankly at me. And after 24 lectures, they know exactly what I mean. And of course, that's the interesting thing which people don't understand about science. And I've actually, although many people may not know this, I've actually done quite a lot of science. I've published lots of scientific papers. And one thing which is absolutely central to doing science, understanding the job, is to discover that doing it can be incredibly tedious. You know, in the days when people used to put, you've seen the film 1,000 times, somebody in a white coat with a little Gilson pipette dribbling something into a tube. I mean, I've done that literally tens of thousands of times. I've collected and scored 350,000 snails, right? So doing that is very dull. And that's one thing which the public doesn't really realize, that science is a production line, and most of it is just as exciting as putting sausages into packages. Okay, so the essence, the idea is to humanize it. Now, I think many scientists resent that, but you can't do it. You can't write a decent science book without trying to do that. I mean, the classic one, and I'll shut up in a second, is of course Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, Feynman's book, which is hilariously funny and beautifully written, and it's about the theoretical physics, a field which is almost impossible for normal mortals to penetrate. But it's a wonderful book. So that's really, the book has to succeed as a book, and as Fiona said, not this little specialist nerdy thing called a science book.
Well, Fiona made a really interesting point as well about changing our ideas about science communication in terms of it's not so much of a niche thing. I think even thinking about the 20 years or so that I've been involved in it is not the niche area that it was 20 years ago. And I think that universities have actually embraced it a lot more. And I am just overjoyed when I see students really getting to grips with talking about their science. And I think that most of our science students kind of accept that one thing that they do as a scientist is communicate, is talk about their science. I just wanted to move on to talk about how we know whether information is reliable or not, because we've said that there are a lot of books out there. There's a lot of information generally, not just books. You know, we are surrounded, almost inundated with information. We talk about an infodemic. So on the one hand, science communication is really important, but Fiona, do we know where most people are getting their science information from, and how reliable is it?
So this gives me an opportunity to make a huge plug here for mainstream news media, because you know, most people think it's a bit old-fashioned, and you know, if you're not on social, then you're not with it. And I just think that actually the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford has been doing some really interesting work during COVID, just reporting that people in their droves are returning to mainstream news media and trusted sources like the BBC or their newspaper of choice or online newspapers. And I think that's a really positive thing. I think that sometimes people mistake the fact that there is a lot of misinformation out there, and then they will ask people, have you seen it? Have you seen misinformation on vaccines? 80% of people say, yes, I have. And suddenly there's a huge scare, you know, what, everybody's getting misinformation. Nobody will want to take the COVID vaccine. And actually, I'm really cautious about that, because I think people are having fun on social media, debating on social media. But in terms of their news, I think they will be going to mainstream news sources. And I think the Science Health, just a big up Rowan here, who's one of them, the Science and Health and medical journalists in the UK are an absolute jewel in the crown. And unfortunately, in a lot of other countries, they have lost their specialist science and health journalists. They've literally been, you know, made redundant, and general news guys cover that brief, and we haven't in the UK. I'm not sure why not, but we haven't, and I think that's a really good thing. So my advice to people is, yeah, you know, go to mainstream news. The science and health reporting in COVID is reliable. It is generally trustworthy. There are exceptions, obviously, but also go to, you know, just check out when you're listening to scientists. Are they from a respected scientific institute? Are they from a university you've heard of? Are they actually actively researching this subject? Are they publishing in this area? Just ask a few questions, I think, about why should I trust this scientist that I'm listening to? And if they've been studying infectious diseases for 30 years at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, then you should listen to them. And if they're a space scientist who got a bit bored in the last 6 months and decided to do a little preprint on mathematical modelling, then maybe just treat it with a little bit of scepticism.
Rowan, how easy do you think it is to separate fact from fiction?
I think it's a bit harder. I think it's a bit harder than, I wish I was as optimistic about it as Fiona is. And I agree with a lot of what she's just said. And thanks for, you know, bigging us up as science journalists. But I do worry about the influence of social media and Facebook in particular. And it's designed to get out divisive information. Because that, you know, that strikes a chord with people. It makes them stay on the platform longer. The algorithm is designed to do that, and Facebook is where most people get their news worldwide. And you know, it's great that people are turning to the BBC and, you know, respected sources of information, but I still think that there's a major problem that we've got is a lot of snippets and weird stuff is just shared around rapidly like wildfire, goes through, and people start saying, oh, you need to gargle with bleach or, you know, whatever. And the problem of false information being shared on social networks, social media is a really bad problem that, you know, I don't have the answer to, but I think we really need to get on top of that somehow.
And do we have a good idea of how, because I mean, it is potentially damaging, but does it actually run its course? I mean, do we see damage from it? Fiona, is there research to show whether people are ingesting those myths and making bad choices effectively?
So I think there is a real scarcity of research, and actually I at the Royal Society are organising some workshops on this, and it was a point I made that if the Royal Society can commission or encourage some more robust evidence, because I've joined too many discussions about this in which people make the assumption that the public read it and therefore they follow it. But I will tell you one piece of evidence which is very striking. It's done every year by Public Health England, and it's on parental attitudes to vaccination. And they've done it every year for decades. And time again, and the recent, you can go and look at them, the recent 2 or 3, they ask people, where are you seeing information about vaccines? And they say, Facebook, Twitter, my friends saying it's dangerous and we shouldn't have our children vaccinated. And then the next question is, has that influenced your decision? And they say, no, I looked on the NICE website, I looked on the PHE website, I went to the BBC, I spoke to my doctor, I spoke to other doctors. And actually that shows that something like really like 70, 80% of parents are reading misinformation about vaccines, but dismissing it. And again, you've seen quite a few media reports already almost wanting to say that the public are going to reject a COVID vaccine. I mean, I see no evidence of that, and anyone I know that they are desperate for a COVID vaccine. But we could talk that up easily, and of course there will be horrible stuff on the internet. And I agree with Rowan. We must tackle it. Scientists must challenge it. We absolutely have a responsibility. But I do worry about this being a slight evidence-free zone here. We're making a lot of assumptions, and we have to answer the very question you've asked, Alice. Does it matter? Does it follow through?
Yeah, we're asking people to look at the evidence, and we need to start with some evidence ourselves. I had a couple of interesting questions come through this afternoon from Twitter, actually. So I'm going to read one out here from Erica Szymanski. Do authors see themselves as having a role in the construction of knowledge? So does science writing go beyond merely reporting what science is doing? Is it actually part of creating a body of science? So I wondered what you thought about that, Steve.
Yeah, I think actually, I think it's actually very much part of the or the narrative of the science. There's a book some of you may have heard of. It's by a chap, largely forgotten now, Charles Darwin, his name is, and he wrote a book called The Origin of Species, and that was a popular science book. If you read The Origin, which I'm sure we all have, I tried to rewrite it once, in various places he says this is a mere sketch. Do not take this too seriously because I have mountains of evidence which I will present later. It was written very quickly and it was a popular science book, and it sold large numbers as a popular science book. And that changed the way the world thinks. I'm not going to say A Brief History of Time did the same, but it made people aware that there was a subject out there which they didn't really know existed. So I do think that they play a really very important part in public culture. I don't think any of them actually put The Origin of Species, apart from my own books, of course, but it's penetrated into public culture, which is in a fascinating way. If you ask, as I'm sure Fiona knows better than I do, if you ask about scientific understanding in various countries across the world, Britain is way up there in the top rank. Okay, in the US, the figures are disastrous. In Spain, is surprisingly poor as well. They're willing to take up crazy theories. So I think in many ways in this country, we've done it right, which doesn't, and it's easy to criticize the press, but if you look at a paper like the Daily Mail, which I look at now and again, and I have to admit, I once wrote for the Daily Telegraph, and I don't go along particularly with their political views. But I think their science reporting is really generally pretty damn good. There's very little craziness in there. It's popular, but these are popular newspapers. So there's less of a problem than some people think. Ironically enough, the problem I've talked about a bit is in many ways the opposite, particularly the BBC. I wrote a BBC Trust report a few years ago about science coverage. And the thing which really irritated the BBC, the news in particular, was this issue I brought up of what I called false balance, that the Today programme invites somebody on who's made a mathematical discovery that 2 and 2 is 4. So this blundering old fool goes on for 10 minutes about 2 and 2 being 4. And in the last 2 minutes of the programme, they bring in this brilliant young mind, expert in geography, who says that 2 and 2 is 5. And at the end of the programme, John Humphreys says, well, 2 and 2 is probably closer to 4 than 5, but the controversy goes on. And that's an issue which doesn't really work in science because, you can't constantly take the middle path. The world isn't flat. It doesn't even just bulge a bit. The world is an oblate spheroid. So you've got to accept that. And in some ways, that's the thing which the media don't accept as well as perhaps they might.
I think in some ways that's about certainty, though, isn't it? I mean, they're being able to communicate the level of certainty that you have about any scientific theory, and the level of certainty that we have about, for instance, the evolution of species, or the fact that the Earth travels around the sun and not the other way round. And then when you look at the certainty around the science in a pandemic, I think you're looking at a very different thing, and that's where the media really struggles to communicate nuance. And Rowan, I wondered what you thought about that from your perspective as an editor at New Scientist.
Yeah, I mean, you've just got to be upfront about it, and that's what politicians aren't, because they're scared of looking weak, or but they've got to be transparent about what we know and what we don't know, and that's not what we've seen with a lot of government advice about coronavirus. So this is a brand new virus, right? We've been learning a huge amount about it, but it's taken months to start to understand, well, maybe herd immunity is not a good idea here. It's not going to actually work. Or how's best to tackle it, and how's best to treat it. So being upfront, being transparent is something that we should all do. It's what scientists do, but it's something that's is antithetical to a politician to sort of be completely honest about that sort of thing.
And another question that came in from Twitter was about simplifying science, and I suppose that sort of feeds into trying to get it right when it comes to nuance and certainty. From James McPhee, he said, is there a time and a place for simplification of science to explain to a non-scientific audience in order to gain their confidence? So, does it gain confidence, or does it lose us confidence? Fiona?
Well, I think who's going to say that we shouldn't be clear and accessible, and and speak simply about science. But I do think there's a danger here, isn't there? And I totally agree with Rowan that, you know, the immunity, take immunity. It is so complicated. We ran a press briefing last week showing that antibodies are waning, and all the media reported that as immunity is waning, it's short-lived. And then we did one yesterday about T-cell immunity, which seems to be still strong after 6 months. So, you know, no doubt people in the public are saying, well, which is it? Do we have waning immunity, or do we have long life? And we don't know. So I think, I mean, yes, absolutely, there is a case for scientists to be simple and clear. And I think I've just watched 2.5 hours of Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance on yet another select committee. I don't know how those guys are still alive. Simply, clearly answering politicians' questions in front of a national TV audience. They are amazing the way they do that. But I think there's a big difference. If you ever simplify in a way that twists the truth, or is convenient, or makes your messages. One thing the Science Media Centre hates is key messages. What are your simple key messages? No, that's for politicians, that's for spin doctors. Scientists should talk about their science in an accessible way, and as Rowan says, emphasise what we don't know as much as what we do know.
Yeah, I think it's always struck me that I occasionally, I knew I was becoming middle-aged a few years ago when I started reading the journal Nature from the front page to the last, rather than opening at the back to see if there are any good jobs going. Okay, a very important moment in any scientist's life, that. But the thing which is true of the journal Nature, or any general science journal, for any scientist, if I pick up Nature, as I do every week, and most of us do, I cannot understand 90% of the papers. Okay, I can probably get a general gist of what they're saying, but if they're astrophysics, I can sort of see, oh, it's about these big things out in space level. But I just don't understand them. But you would expect that, because science as a unity is in fact incredibly fractionated. It's a lot of very separate specializations, and there's rather little interaction among them. And that's why I think popular science writing plays a very important part. I once saw a diagram, which was a clever idea done by some Belgian statisticians, about the scientific literature. And what it did was to take the web of science, which, as we all know, is the equivalent of Google cubed for science, takes all the scientific literature and analyzes it, and make a diagram that showed the size of various fields. And by far the biggest was biochemistry and cell biology. By far the smallest was astronomy and astrophysics. But if you look at the coverage of those fields, there's far more coverage of, you know, the sky at night and that kind of stuff than there is of biochemistry and molecular biology. So that's another thing I think we should think about, is, are we admitting to the public, or revealing to the public, the extraordinary breadth of science rather than picking off the juicy bits?
Well, I hope that one of the outcomes of this year will be that the interest that's been generated in science and science communication will continue. That might be an optimistic way of looking at it, but I think that might be something that we take away from 2020. Now, I think we could have gone on with this discussion for much, much longer, but I'm going to have to draw it to a close. So thank you, Steve Jones, Fiona Fox and Rowan Hooper, for an absolutely fascinating discussion on science communication. Thank you all. So yes, we could have gone on, but we do have a book prize to announce. So having discussed how important science writing is for increasing science literacy, let's hear from our 6 shortlisted authors.
Hello, my name is Gaia Vince, and I am the author of Transcendent: Humans Evolved Through Fire, Language, Beauty and Time. It's really the story of how we need ourselves that makes us special. And that to me is the most interesting question. Why are we not like all the other animals? Because if you believe, as I do, that we evolved biologically, how come the chimps aren't dominating the planet? So this is something I wanted to investigate, and really Transcendence is the story of our particular evolution. Stories about how different environments produce different types of language, about how beauty drove us to explore the world, how different types of agriculture produced patriarchal societies. And these stories of us are really are who we are now, and they're the clue to how we might solve some of the biggest problems that we're facing right now. Science communication and written science communication has never been more vital. I started becoming interested in this whole subject when I was researching my first book about the Anthropocene, about how humans have changed the planet. This is obviously a huge topic, and the only way to address this big topic and to build an argument cumulatively is through a book, I think. It's such a fascinating story. It's so complex, and it's how we drove our own evolution. We really made ourselves, and now that we have made ourselves, where are we going?
I'm Linda Scott, and my book is called The XX Economy, The Epic Potential of Empowering Women. The phrase XX economy describes the global economy of women and the particular pattern of inequality that exists in every nation between genders around the world. Is there some biological or natural basis for it? And of course, people who have wanted to justify male supremacy have always manipulated science to try to shore up their position. So it was important for me to look deeply into every question, every claim that had been made, whether it's that there's some evolutionary advantage to male domination or whether women have differently wired brains. What I found when I did all this research is that the most up-to-date science tells us a very different and much more subtle and humane story. It's important to get these subtleties of the newest science out to the public because these antiquated beliefs are harmful, and that's why I wrote this book. Science writing is really important. It's important to be accessible, and it's important to be up to date. It's also really important to address misinformation. We're at a point now where negative takes on scientific discoveries can float around the internet with horrible impact if they're not countered with truth and with up-to-date findings. Science writing helps people to understand better the world that they're in and the people that they're with.
Hi, I'm Bill Bryson, and my book is The Body, a guide for occupants. Now, my idea with the book is that it has long seemed to me that we spend our entire existences inside this package of tissue, that we occupy this space that we call the body. And yet, most of us, sketchiest of ideas of how we're put together and what goes on inside us. So the idea of the book was simply to try to understand this marvelous and miraculous contraption that is us. Well, one way of looking at it, I think, is that each of us is a universe of 37.2 trillion cells, give or take. And these 37 trillion or so cells work in perfect concert most of the time to give us form and shape and to allow us to enjoy the rare and supremely agreeable condition known as life. Now, to me, that is an absolute miracle and certainly worthy of a book. Why is science writing important? I think because science is important. Science is the most vital of all human endeavors, I think. It answers all our questions. It tells us who we are and where we come from, where we're going, what we have to do if we want to get to where we want to go. If we're going to have a world worth living in 50 or 100, it'll be science that gets us there. So I think the importance of science writing is to capture an importance and vitality of science and convey that to the general public.
I'm Dr. Camilla Pang, and my book is called Explaining Humans, What Science Can Teach Us About Life, Love and Relationships. My book is basically written from an autistic point of view because I have autism and I find humans very confusing. I mean, like, to the point where I don't understand these social nuances that everything is built upon. And so to survive and to get through, I used something that was very concrete to me, which was science. I wrote this to survive, basically. I wrote it as a necessity. I didn't actually realise I was writing a book. I kind of scribbled in books. I wrote notes and post-it notes, and they were everywhere. They were my map of the world and my lens through which I communicated. And so This book was a culmination of all the different notes that I'd taken, and with the different chapters, each underpinning a scientific principle, they are my attempt to both question, challenge, the norms that we all assume as humans. And one of the main things that I've noticed being autistic is that I don't have any preconceptions or assumptions, and so I've had to make them from the ground up, and this is my attempt to do that. So I'm really happy. It's my first baby, but there's much like all things in life, when you feel like they've finished, it just reminds you that there's so much more evolution that can be done. And I like that, because you invest yourself into something that you love and you create, but then there's always room for more. You'll never be finished with a book. You will never be finished with an artwork, and I'm never going to be finished getting to know people, and I probably wouldn't want it any other way.
My name is Susanna Cahalan. I'm the author of The Great Pretender, the undercover mission that changed our understanding of madness. The Great Pretender started as an exploration and later became an investigation of a famous 1973 study published in Science called On Being Sane in Insane Places. The study, published by Stanford professor David Rosen, involved 8 participants volunteering to go undercover in psychiatric hospitals across the country. The outcome and conclusions of the study scandalized the field of psychiatry and raised serious questions about the state of diagnosis. The opening line of that famous paper went, "If sanity and insanity exist, how shall we know them?" That question reverberated in my bones because it is essentially the question, what is mental illness? It resonated with me deeply, as I was once with a serious mental illness. I started to study, and more questions emerged. I started to come to the conclusion that a study I once lionized had serious flaws. So the obvious choice for me was to write a book about it. I particularly loved going through the archives and learning so much about the history of psychiatry. What science writing does is humanize the discipline by showing the limits and the potentials. I truly hope readers have the same experience that I did writing it. I hope that they feel the enthusiasm and the rush of excitement of the new discoveries. And I hope readers walk away with a brighter view of the future ahead.
My name is Jim Alkalini, and the title of my book is The World According to Physics. This is my love affair with the subject that I have spent my life working on and thinking about. It's my ode to physics. It's a compact, small, popular science book. I don't cover the whole of the history of physics in it, but I try and explain where our current understanding is. What's the cutting edge of what we know about the nature of the universe, the nature of space and time? What are atoms made of? Where did we come from? And where are those mysteries that we have yet to understand? Things like dark matter and dark energy, whether there was something before the Big Bang. I wanted to get it across in as simple and compact a form as possible. One thing I mentioned in the book is that about 40 years ago, Stephen Hawking wrote a famous article in which he said the end of physics is approaching, that we're almost going to understand everything about the nature of space and time and matter and energy. And actually it turns out he was wrong. And this book, I think, in a way celebrates the fact that there are still mysteries out there. There are still things we don't understand. I think I was motivated to write this book because I really wanted to get across my passion for the subject that I have been obsessed about for the last 45 years. This is my way of explaining the universe I've struggled to understand all my life, but in a way that I hope everyone can follow.
Oh, what amazing books. So one of those books is going to win the prize this evening, but we're going to keep you waiting just a little bit longer before we announce that. It is a particularly tough job to choose a pinnacle of excellence from this field of excellence. So I'd like to thank the judges. Now, judging this prize is a tough and time-consuming job. And of course, this year had the added complication of all the meetings being held remotely. So we're extremely grateful for their patience, their time and their expertise. The judging panel was chaired by Professor Anne Osborne, FRS, with Katie Guest, Dr. Kartik Suba, Sophie Ward and Catherine Fry. Thanks again to our judges. This prize also wouldn't be possible without our sponsor, so we're now going to hear a few words from them.
Hello, and by way of introduction, my name is Angus Hallhouse from Insight Investment. I'd like to start by saying what a pleasure it is for Insight to sponsor this important competition. We're delighted that this is our 5th year of sponsoring the Royal Society Insight Investment Science Book Prize. And thank you to the Royal Society for accepting Insight as your prize sponsor. We're very proud to support institutions who have a role in public engagement with the sciences. And the Royal Society's ambition with this prize, the exceptional quality of the shortlisted books, and the value of highlighting excellence in science writing is more important now than it ever has been. And congratulations to all of those authors who've been shortlisted tonight. The role of those who are brave enough to challenge conventional wisdom by introducing new perspectives and ways of thinking should be something that all of us should encourage, and it's something that Insight are very proud to support. Each of the shortlisted authors have created something original and thought-provoking, not to mention bringing great pleasure to readers from a wide variety of science and non-science backgrounds. It is that ability to distill complex thoughts, ideas and scholarship for a wider enjoyment that are the hallmarks of this award. So good luck to all of the shortlisted authors, best wishes from Insight, and please everyone stay safe. Thank you.
And now, finally, it is time to announce the winner. And to do that, here is the President of the Royal Society, Venki Ramakrishnan.
Good evening. I'm Venki Ramakrishnan, the President of the Royal Society. And it's a great pleasure to participate in this year's Insight Investment Royal Society Book Prize. And normally, this is an event that I very much look forward to. It's one of my favorite events in the year. It's held in London at Carlton House Terrace. I get to meet the authors. There's a nice live discussion. But this year, everything has to be done remotely. And I'm here speaking to you from Cambridge. But nevertheless, the excitement of these books remain. We can enjoy these books wherever we are. And it's fantastic, as in every year, the range of topics covered by the books on the short list, and even the books that were on the long list, is just shows you the tremendous diversity of science and the many, many fascinating things about science and the ways of looking at science. And so, without further ado, I would like to, first of all, thank our sponsor, Insight Investment, for supporting the Royal Society's Science Book Prize. It's a very worthy adventure. It's a valuable contribution to bringing science and science writing to the public. And now it's my pleasure to open the gold envelope and announce this year's winner. So the winner is Camilla Pang for Explaining Humans, What Science Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Relationships. So congratulations to you, Camilla. Thank you.
Goodness me, I can't quite believe it. The irony is, if I knew what people liked, there would be no book. So the writing of this was entirely an instinctive fluke just to get through, to be honest. And so, as all good things in life are, they're unplanned. And Beside the fact that Zoom can buzzkill a lot of celebration, I actually think that this one is very on brand. I wouldn't want it any other way. And I couldn't be more grateful for the Royal Society in choosing Explaining Humans to win this prize. It's an absolute honour. And to be recognised that I can write, and highlighting that the voice of neurodiversity can contribute and has space to be heard. So this book is also a voice for those who are also wanting to understand the human that they love. So for the neurotypicals that have someone who they just want to help and enable, because everyone has the right to live and the duty to be. And my family and friends have always reminded me of that. So thank you to them as well. And if I could give a fraction of the hope to others that I've had, then that's a job well done, to be honest. I'd also like to give a massive thank you to all the shortlisted authors who I greatly admire, and I've absolutely loved reading your books and getting to know you all on Zoom, especially in times of great disconnect, like well, right now really. And I've really felt that sense of community, which is just so important. Because let's face it, 2020's a little bit of a nightmare, but there is a light. There is a light, since science highlights the incredible power of it being a place of reassurance, certainty, whilst also being a point of inquiry. And this book is completely indebted to all the science books that have held Explaining Humans up and provided my place of certainty. And this is the least I could do, giving back to the very thing that saved me. So I'd like to end with a quote from Snoop Dogg, 2019. I'd like to thank me for believing in me, because I know, regardless, the little me would be very proud.
Well, a huge congratulations to Camilla, and I would love to be there with you in the Royal Society. I will raise a glass to you here at home and to all of our amazing shortlisted authors tonight. Thank you again to Insight Investment for sponsoring this prize, and to the judges and to our panelists as well for the insightful discussion this evening. And finally, thank you for watching. I know that you'll be rushing to get your hands on these books if you haven't got them already, and I really hope you enjoy reading them. Science is part of our culture. It's good night from me, Alice Roberts, and from the Royal Society. Keep reading science books, stay safe, and keep well. Good night.